Hello, welcome everyone for our noon hour event. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Melanie Tanyelian. I'm the director for the Center of Armenian Studies here at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I welcome you to our second panel in the series Environmental Armenia, Climate Crisis, War, or Conflict and Activism. Before we start, I want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies, the Donia Human Rights Center, the International Institute, the Program in the Environment, and the School for Environment and Sustainability. I would like to also, of course, thank Naira Tumanian, who helped put this conference together and who is working behind the scenes to keep us going. And I will ask our audience to please submit your questions to the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And I hope that I will get to all of your questions. This panel called The Landscapes of War will consider what we might think of as the most ignored aspect of war, and that's the environmental impact of violent conflict. We will focus on the Southern Caucasus and in particular the impact of the recent war against the Armenian population of Artsakh. And we will hear about the impact of the war on land use, environmental damages caused by military campaigns, human and wildlife displacement, among other issues. The 40-day long conflict that took place last year resulted in Azeri occupation of larger parts of Artsakh, military casualty in the thousands, civilians dead, missing and displaced, with those on the Armenian side far outnumbering those on the Azeri side. The environmental impact of the conflict, for some perhaps a mere side effect, but a reality for those on the ground who are dependent on natural resources, forest, rivers, and agricultural land for their income, was significant. The full extent of the impact of the environment is still unclear. Environmental destruction became eventually which might be surprising, the subject of a fierce social media battle with the Azeri government systematically orchestrating propaganda campaigns facilitated by the oppression of free speech and critical journalism that might have exposed war crimes committed by Azeri forces and their allies during the course of the war. It was a strategy, of course, that was quite taken from the playbook of Azerbaijan's neighbor and ally, Turkish Prime Minister Eoghan, as we all know, has cracked down quite violently on voices of dissent, including many of our academic colleagues who have faced prosecution and prison times for speaking out against the government. We are being persecuted, a colleague of mine just recently said when I was talking to them on the phone. In the context of denied access and especially fierce government censorship and distortion from the side of the Azerbaijan government, how can environmental agencies, nonprofit organizations, and activists determine the extent of destruction is what is at stake today. And to shed light on these issues, we are joined by two speakers today. Eoghan Darbyshire, who is with the Conflict and Environment Observatory, and he uses ecosystem the sort of ecosystem, what he calls it, of open source information, from Earth observation data to social media reports, to research, monitor, characterize, and communicate the environmental dimension of conflict. Eoghan has an academic background in air pollution research, conducting remote sensing mechanisms to characterize our rapidly changing environments. And here he has done incredible research in the context of the city of Delhi, the Arctic, as well as the Arabian Peninsula and the Amazon rainforest. He holds a PhD in atmospheric physics from the University of Manchester, where he also completed an undergraduate degree in environmental science and worked as a postdoctoral researcher. And joining us as well is Mariam Yeghiazaryan, who is a freelance journalist and documentary filmmaker who is based in Yerevan, so it's late where she is at. And the scope of Mariam's interests include the environment, human and non-human animal rights, as well as media studies and multimedia art. And Mariam is currently writing an article that she hopes is soon to be published on the environmental impact of last year's war in the region. So we're very much looking forward to reading that piece and hearing some of your observations today, Mariam. So our audience, you can, of course, again, just to mention, pass on your questions into the Q&A, and we will get to them. But we'll begin with Eoghan, who is going to give us a little bit of the presentation of the work that he does, and then Mariam as well, and then we have a Q&A thereafter. So thank you all for being here.
First of all, I just want to say thank you to Melanie and those involved in hosting this conference and giving a platform to an array of voices on what is a very important topic. To those watching, hello. Good morning, afternoon or evening, wherever you may be. I'm here in the UK, where I work for the Conflict and Environment Observatory, CEOBS, and we are a charity with the primary goal of increasing awareness and understanding of the environmental and derived humanitarian consequences of conflicts and military activities, of which there are many. Now, we're only a small organisation. We try to cover a lot of ground in observations, advocacy, policy and legal frameworks, and our capacity limits us to only monitoring a few core countries, and none of these are in the Caucasus. So why did we end up covering the short-lived Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in this region, kind of outside of our orbit? Well, we're also driven by the principle that access to reliable environmental information is vital in relation to armed conflicts. Openness and transparency are critical when the environment becomes politicized. And this is exactly what we witnessed. We were witnessing online in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, where this environmental disinformation and fake news were so rampant. So we thought we'd take a look, and whilst we were doing this kind of initial research, two big concerns became apparent. First of all, the range of environmental issues that were at play, and secondly, how kind of poorly informed and partisan the way these were all reported for many years. So this led to the report that we wrote and published in February, which is by no means comprehensive, and we kind of hoped would just be a kind of starting point, non-partisan starting point to raise and counter some of these concerns, with the hope that others in civil society or academia would take the work on and go and investigate some of these threads in a bit more detail. I'm just kind of giving all of this background up front, just because, you know, the report has had a little bit of pushback from both Azerbaijani and Armenians, and we've also been accused of both sidesism. So yeah, just to kind of interesting to bear in mind. Anyway, so now on to the presentation, which will guide you through the key points of our report, and then I'll finish with a kind of brief update of what's happened since February. So this is the first slide, and a bit of a primer into the context of the conflict and the landscape of Nagorno-Karabakh. And I know many people here will not need this, but just in case anybody who is watching does not know, so as Melanie was saying, the conflict lasted 44 days, started just over a year ago, and the size of the area governed as Nagorno-Karabakh significantly decreased to the area of the blue line here in this map, and Azerbaijan took over the kind of area enclosed in red. The landscape is characterized by a mix of forests, which are really rich in biodiversity, herbaceous vegetation, and to the east and to the south, cropland. And on this map, just to point out two features I will refer back to later on. So right in the kind of northwest here is the Sot gold mine, which now sits directly on the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and also the Sarsang reservoir, which sits here within Nagorno-Karabakh. One other thing about the landscape, of course, is how mountainous it is, especially in the north and west. And just a little bit more background on the history before last year's fighting. So the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh was said to be frozen since 1994. Prior to that, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the clashes between the kind of newly independent nations escalated into this bloody and hugely culturally significant war, and tensions remained close to the surface ever since, with some low intensity fighting, but all throughout a kind of ever hardening narratives of victimhood and rather than any attempts at reconciliation. Also, the scars from that fighting in the 90s are still visible in the landscape. Hundreds of abandoned settlements along the line of contact, which is this barren and pitted strip to the east of Nagorno-Karabakh. Also, just on the name, in case anyone's wondering, Nagorno-Karabakh is itself political and contested, and I'll be using the word Nagorno-Karabakh in this presentation. I'll be doing the report just because that's the kind of established international convention, just as a FYI. Okay, so let's get into it. So one unusual feature of the conflict was the extent to which the environment featured in the discourse, and with this term ecocide, which was co-opted and misused and weaponized even by both parties. And this led to kind of very polarized social media. And this was aided by kind of both militaries uploading daily combat footage and a lack of objective journalists on the ground. Just as a reminder, Azerbaijan is one of the worst ranking countries for press freedom, and actively encouraged journalists to avoid the conflict. However, the extent to which environment was used as one of the central motifs of the disinformation war was kind of surprising to us to begin with. We're used to kind of framing the environment as the silent victim. But it is interesting that actually globally this is kind of an emerging trend, that this environmental disinformation in conflict zones is we're seeing it in a few places now. That said, it wasn't until after this kind of iconic imagery of the fires and incendiary weapons emerged that it really, went hot on social media. And kind of both the conflict parties had very different approaches to this kind of social media information sharing. So firstly, on the Armenian side, this is where civil societies organizations were really prominent, and a key moment came on the 2nd of November when 51 NGOs signed what they called an ecocide alert. And this included loads of Armenian organizations, but also signatories from kind of NGOs across Europe. And the alert highlighted the significant biodiversity and endangered species, and noted how the use of white phosphorus posed an existential threat to their survival, and called on action from global environmental actors to prevent ecocide. Now, this action was not forthcoming, but kind of interestingly and significantly, the language in the actual call wasn't too partisan. It didn't attribute blame to either side. It was more concerned about the effects. But the way in which it was shared online then by people sharing the call was somewhat different. There was a lot more part. On the Azerbaijani military, and having this really emotive image of this kind of Persian leopard in flames. So in contrast to the civil society-led approach of Armenia, the environmental messaging from the Azerbaijani side was more government-driven, as you would expect, and in particular the Ministry of Ecology and Natural Resources. They were important actors, producing a series of memes such as these we see on the screen now, and these were circulated on social media, including by all the official accounts like their delegation to UNESCO or their Canadian embassy. They also did things like hold roundtable events and do press releases. And another element was the way that they were targeting international publications. So here is an example in Your Active, which is a kind of a legitimate network which aims at informing EU policy. But the Azerbaijanis paid for an article in here, and it was kind of along the lines of like environmental terrorism of Armenia, etc. And intriguingly, we then find this article referenced elsewhere on the internet. And on news sites that at first look appear legitimate, but then you start to look closer and closer, and it turns out these are kind of actually shell sites for kind of Azerbaijani content. And what it is there's this ecosystem of kind of fake news sites playing off each other, all with the kind of overall aim of controlling this international narrative. The other thing has already been mentioned about Turkey, and what we found on by kind of anecdotally, like looking at the tweets, was that there seems to be a lot more backing Azerbaijani, putting a pro-Azerbaijani message out there. And it turns out that lots of this traffic was indeed coming from Turkey. And we know this because there's a Turkish fact-checking not-for-profit social enterprise did a full kind of analysis of this, and yeah, found out that the kind of most commonly the languages that were most commonly used to share this fake information was Turkish and Azerbaijani. And indeed, during the conflict on Facebook, they acted and closed down like a large network of kind of fake news activity connected to the Azeri state. But kind of interestingly, why did this environmental disinformation become so rampant online and evoke such strong feelings? Well, the landscape, the mountains, the forests, the wildlife, it's all cultural heritage. And that's why people get upset about it. And this is really clear, for example, in the lyrics to the System of a Down song, Protect the Land, which was released during the conflict as a kind of pro-arts like anthem, and the themes of environment and landscape as at its core. And in the kind of press releases associated with this, the band were talking about how the forests were being set alight using like phosphorus and so on and so forth. On the other hand, and this is really bizarre, the pro-Azerbaijani message was spread by a totally different demographic, not connected to the landscape, but it was the kind of international K-pop community, the Korean pop, which is slightly strange the way the world works sometimes. Okay, now I've only really briefly touched on the disinformation side here, and it is deserving of so much more attention by like genuine experts in the field, and I hope that does get taken on at some point. So I'm going to move into the fire element now. So during and after the conflict, both sides accused each other of using fire as a weapon, particularly through the use of incendiary weapons, for example, to remove tree cover, so they had lines of sight for shooting and so on. So the locations of the fires are actually recorded by satellites, and I've marked them on this satellite image from the 30th of October. And you can see the smoke from the fire here, as the fires here are really visible. And you can see kind of clusters in certain locations, to the south, west, and to the north, and in the interior, quite near the Lachin corridor, and around the kind of main urban centres. But how do we know that these fires are anything to do with the conflict? It could just be simply to do with the climate of the time. Well, in 2020, it certainly saw the greatest number of fires over that same period than any other year, and by a long way. But to test further whether these were simply the result of favourable weather conditions, we kind of went into more detail in the report and found that no, they were not. That these were anomalous and can be directly kind of linked to the conflict. So using more satellite data and Earth observations, we were able to kind of gain a better understanding of the frequency, type, and scale and impact of these landscape fires. And we estimated the total burnt area to be something along the lines of 100 kilometers squared. And this graph here shows that the vast majority of these fires were in forests, and hence would have had a really significant impact on the biodiversity there. And also the locals who rely on the kind of ecosystem services provided by the forest for their livelihood. So here is another figure which shows a different element. This is showing the air pollution and the smoke from the fires. And you can see this kind of large regional plume. It had enhanced levels of lots of pollutants like carbon monoxide and nitrogen dioxide, black carbon aerosol, even formaldehyde, very close to the fire. And all these are kind of, pollutants which will have led to some like acute environmental health incidents, where the plume was. Another element of fire, the international media reported quite extensively on damage to the built environment from intentional fires. Allegedly, these were lit by Armenians as they abandoned territory. And this was kind of widespread on social media by pro-Azerbaijani accounts, but also reported in Associated Press and Yahoo News, although again with kind of very little evidence. That said, we were kind of able to identify the likely destruction of some houses in this one location, the village of Charektar, by doing some kind of analysis of high resolution imagery. So where the red pixels are here, that's where we think there's been damage. But we can't say this with total confidence, and we don't know who the perpetrators are or what their motives were. And then this is kind of a big limit of remote sensing, and kind of illustrates the need for on-the-ground monitoring and how important that is. Okay, talking of which, onto the use of incendiary weapons. Now, they're a type of munition which ignite upon contact with oxygen, so air, and they're intended to set fires, cause burns, produce really thick smoke during the day, and light up areas at night time. They inflict kind of really serious internal and external burning, and the smoke is toxic and it can harm the environment through fires and through bioaccumulation in water, soils, crops, animals. Now, there's evidence from videos, A, B, and C here, and from hospital records of the use of incendiary weapons. And not surprisingly, both sides blamed each other. So kind of trying to evidence the events and the responsible parties is really important because of the significant impacts it's had on people and on the environment. I'm not going to go into huge detail here, but kind of briefly, we collated the key videos and tried to locate and understand what had happened in each. And we were fairly confident of what's happened in video B here, based on a few different sources. We think it's the result of an explosion at an improvised field ammunition depot, an Armenian field depot, which is shown in videos D, E, and F from different sources. However, videos A and videos C, it's a very limited information to go on, and really there are studies out there, but none of the data is very compelling evidence. We actually tried ourselves at CEOBS to do this. I kind of came up with this novel methodology, but it didn't work. Really frustrating because of lack of capacity and lack of computational resource. So I'm just going to put in a little marketing pitch here. If there's any students out there, environmental science or computer science, who'd be interested in taking this on as like a research project, then please do get in touch. Okay, now onto water, which was initially one of the kind of more overlooked dynamics of the conflict. So in the build up to the conflict, Azerbaijan was in the midst of a water crisis. During summer 2020, water levels in the Kura River dropped by 2.5 meters, and there were drops of 16 meters in reservoirs. And this can be blamed on essentially bad management practices and over abstraction of groundwater. But this had a really significant impact on drinking water and agricultural water supplies, and it became a kind of top level agenda item for President Aliyev last summer. In the context of the recent fighting, this is relevant because Nagorno-Karabakh is rich in water resources, and sitting upstream of the kind of Azerbaijani agricultural land, it moderates the flow, and this is all kind of centered around this deeply politicized Sarsang reservoir, which we can see in the center of the image here. Now, there is quite a long history of the water dispute surrounding the Sarsang, and one where we don't have the time to go into here. But I think the kind of history is nicely captured in this quote by Veliev et al., who compare actions taken on the Sarsang to actions taken on the similar Zonkar reservoir in South Ossetia, where a depoliticalization of issues allowed successful outcomes and allowed essential maintenance. And I suspect this quote applies not only to the Sarsang reservoir, but many other elements. Anyway, given the failure of any cooperation, the chance to gain control of Nagorno-Karabakh's water resources would clearly be beneficial to the kind of Azerbaijani economic and political interests. And then therefore maybe it was a potential factor leading to the decision to intensify the military operation. We will never know, but I will note how quickly there were tenders for water management infrastructure as soon as the war finished. Also, just on the Sarsang dam, it's still in need of essential maintenance. This is a kind of big problem, and you know, a kind of risk assessments do need to be performed soon, because it is now a very old dam. Okay, now on to another environmental element. It's the mineral resource. Following the peace deal, there have been kind of disputes over the Sot gold mine. This is the largest in Armenia, very important for its public purse. Now it sits directly on the Armenia-Azerbaijani border, divided into, again, this has a history of kind of causing environmental damage, water, soil, air pollution from explosive residues and heavy metals. And in our report in February, we identified some potential risks from inaction and from nothing happening there. Now, there have been some earthworks on the Armenian side, but last week, Anglo-Asian, they had a company who had the rights for the Azerbaijani side. They gave them up, citing ongoing security concerns. And looking at the latest satellite imagery, it seems like the open cast mine is now flooding. Water levels are as high as they have been in at least 5 years. And this is potentially worrying because this is usually, flooding of disused mines is usually a controlled process. And this seems to be anything but. Moving on, another ongoing threat to the environment is from the toxic remnants of war, both from last year, but still from the fighting in the 1990s. This clearance activity will take, you know, many years, even decades, during which time the leakage of toxic residues can cause serious environmental health risks. At the same time, when the demining occurs, if it's mechanically removed, that can cause some serious landscape damage. As well as unexploded ordnance, there's conflict debris, which is, again, potentially adds to the pollution burden. Just one example, this picture here of a destroyed electrical substation in Stepanakert. And this, when these are destroyed, these can be associated with a toxic chemical called PCB, which is a persistent pollutant and is carcinogenic. Essentially, the only way to assure the safety of all these potentially contaminated locations, of which there is many, is by ground-based monitoring. There needs to be measurements. Another element, along the new kind of militarized corridors and the new lines of contact, such as the Lachin corridor, it remains an open question as to how the land will be managed now and in the future, and if it will look similar to how the line of contact has looked for the last 30 years. And here we show a nice comparison between 1979 and 2019. You can see clearly the line of contact. But another thing you can see is the post-Soviet agricultural transformation in Azerbaijan, all these very tightly compacted agricultural patches. And this is driven largely by the kind of over-abstraction of groundwater I was talking about earlier. And with that in mind, there's now an open question: what happens to the land which is now in Azerbaijani control? I think there is an intention to convert some of it to agricultural lands. There's many challenges with this, and will these developments have any environmental impact assessments? So this leads on to what's happened since we put the report out in February. Unfortunately, it didn't act as this springboard for more evidence-led kind of scientific studies as we wanted. And this is kind of very sad because the lack of open and transparent data is a barrier to peace. But it's not surprising. This is similar across many conflict and post-conflict areas. We kind of see it all the time in this job, and it's, you know, very unfortunate. Climate change is on the agenda of these big organizations or donors, but actually the environment people have to live in the present time sometimes gets less attention. So what's happened instead is that the disinformation, the greenwash, and the division have continued apace. In particular, Azerbaijan have continued to put a lot of resource into trying to take control of the international narrative. They've produced lengthy reports such as this, ecocide in Karabakh, and presented at high-level fora like the UN Security Council or Environment Assembly, and in numerous conferences around the world. One has to wonder, what is their kind of end purpose here? I've got slides wrong way around. The same is true of the plans Azerbaijan has to build green smart infrastructure. Is this genuine, or is it greenwash? There's no explicit details yet, but analysts do say Azerbaijan want to decrease the country's dependence on fossil fuel because it means more profits from export. So if this is to happen, what oversight is there to ensure that these green projects are being done in truly a sustainable way? Just bringing in an example from another conflict, our work in Yemen identified how the rapid uptake of solar-powered pumps for agricultural irrigation has led to like a really significant drop in their groundwater levels. Now, the pace of development in the territory gained by Azerbaijan has been really swift. Again, in this victory rush, what, if any, environmental impact assessments have been conducted into things like airport expansions, into new highways, into new mining works here in the vicinity of Venjali, which has apparently significant gold reserves, and here near the village of Signax. So with this in mind, the accusation of greenwash might be directed at some of the tree planting schemes promised by both sides to respond to the forest cover lost during the conflict. It's unclear how widespread these activities actually are, but it's important they are done in a sensitive way if they are to happen. So not monocultures, but things which are good for creating rich biodiversity and ecosystem services. Also, no surprises, the online environmental disinformation war has continued long after the conflict, as two examples show here. And just touching on what's happened with incendiary weapons since, there's been more documentation on the injuries caused by their use, but as far as I'm aware, no sampling of vegetation or water or anything to confirm the type of incendiary weapon that was used, white phosphorus or thermite, or the exact locations they hit. And therefore, it's hard to truly pin down the responsible parties and make sure they are responsible. But a lot of this activity has come from the Armenian side. From the Azerbaijani side, it's mainly sound bites in media interviews. They're not kind of proactively pushing the agenda, which, you know, maybe take your own conclusions from. So away from the greenwash and disinformation, the main issue has been water, and this will be no surprise to anyone who listened to the talk yesterday from Irina. So there's been concerns about a lack of water in Stepanivka because of the loss of reservoirs and the loss of territory, and also the increased number of migrants now in the city. A stone's throw away, so they're planning to build new reservoirs, and then a stone's throw away in Susha, new reservoirs are also being built by the Azeris and new pipelines. And again, the question has to be how much thought has gone into the environmental sustainability of these projects. On the other hand, one repeated Azeri accusation is the pollution of the Oigi River. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And that's a tributary of the Aras. And they allege that there's been this pollution by the mine, the copper molybdenum plants in Kapan. And from our kind of satellite imagery analysis, there's certainly times when the colour of this river looks heavily sedimented or polluted, and the colour change happens adjacent to the mining area. Now, the reason I show this is because I think it actually represents an opportunity for open data and for transparency to help protect the environment and even ensure national disputes over it are based on evidence and conducted in good faith. So monitoring the water quality here to address the downstream concerns by Azerbaijan, monitoring the flow level to kind of address upstream concerns with Turkey's management of the water is something that could be done. It could be done by the Armenian government. It could be a joint activity between the Armenian government, the Azerbaijani government, maybe the Iranian government. If not, it could even be left to civil society or academia to take up the mantle, and it might be a good activity because it's technical in nature and therefore could be depoliticized. Okay, so the last slide, and we've covered a lot of ground in this presentation, and not much of it is very good news or very positive, but it kind of has illuminated the importance of the environment as part of the conflict and the subsequent period, and also how important it is as a resource to be managed and used, and also as a key part of cultural heritage. And there's so many kind of actors and stakeholders, most of all the civilians who live or lived in the area, and so many open questions remain on the extent of the environmental damage during the conflict and the kind of indirect effects which will linger long after. Who is responsible and what, if any, remediation is required? So there remains a need on the ground for kind of good environmental and technical assessments, as I've kind of previously said, and these need to be transparent and open, and this may be a good avenue towards peace. The continued bad faith attacks and propaganda only lead to more conflict and more suffering. And things like this will help fact check these kind of the many claims on social media. One final thing is that on top of this, sound and evidence-based environmental governance is required by all parties, and I think that's something that's been missing to some extent so far, and something that civil society can help advocate for. Okay, I think that's about it. Sorry if that was a bit of a whirlwind.
Thank you so much, Eoghan, for the presentation, and I'll pass on the microphone to Mariam.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Mariam. I'm an independent journalist and documentary filmmaker based in Yerevan, Armenia. Also an earthling who cares about the environment, human and non-human animal rights. Yeah, a quick disclaimer that I don't represent, so I'm basically for Armenia, but I don't represent my government or any organization. But at the same time, this article that hopefully is going to be published soon is a result of a project by Imagine Center, which is a Center for Conflict Resolution, which the board of which is consists of Armenians, Georgians, and Azerbaijanis. While working on this article, I had a contributor from Azerbaijan so that I could have an access to Azerbaijani sources. Yeah, and I find it important to mention. I would very much like to start my presentation with this image that I took in August 2020. And I'll explain further why, just remember this. Yeah, so in this report, I'm going to share the findings from Armenia and also Azerbaijan at some point. So it's basically findings that you're going to see as text, and sometimes you're going also to see some visuals that haven't been made on the ground. So I haven't been in Nagorno-Karabakh, so they are related to the topic in a more of a symbolic way. So as it has been mentioned earlier, for 44 days, different type of military equipments were tearing apart the lands of the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh, also known as Artsakh, as well as Armenia and Azerbaijan. And the parties still accuse each other for using prohibited weapons, including the white phosphorus, the use of which has not been scientifically proven so far. And damaging the environment, yet neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan or any third party or organization has stated a willingness to conduct an independent ground investigation to measure and assess the impact of the Second Karabakh War on the environment. Almost a year after the ceasefire that has been signed on 9th of November in 2020, there is no comprehensive, credible, and publicly available data, scientific research, and/or analysis on the scale and the nature of the damage caused to the environment, forests, wildlife, natural resources, as well as humans who, among other animals, are the direct bearers of the harm caused by the to the environment by the warfare. Coming to Armenia in November 2020, late October, early November, human rights defender of the Republic of Armenia and then human rights ombudsman of the Republic of Artsakh authored a report on the use of incendiary ammunition of mass destruction against civilian objects in Nagorno-Karabakh, claiming that on the 29th of October, Azerbaijani forces launched targeted attacks against the forest areas of Nagorno-Karabakh to the direction of Martuni region. And the authors state that those weapons possibly contained white phosphorus or other similar chemical elements. And it also declares that the sources for such an assertion were the ministries of the defense of the Ministry of Defense of Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. So what I basically did was trying to figure out what kind of sources exactly they have used. And so according to the Office of the Human Rights Ombudsman of Armenia, and I'm basically quoting, a fact-finding process, private conversations with servicemen, residents of the community bodies have been used as the main sources for their announcement and for their report. And it's still not clear what kind of sources in terms of the scientific facts and the questions related to expertise and ground investigation did not receive a response from the Human Rights Ombudsman of Armenia. So they basically skipped such questions related to expertise or the ground investigation. The sources related to the Human Rights Ombudsman of Nagorno-Karabakh state that 15 hectares of forest have been burned in Nagorno-Karabakh. And then according to the Ministry of Environment of Republic of Armenia, it's 95, basically mostly in Sunik. And the minister also stated that it will be possible to measure and assess the full extent of the damage only after the demining process is completed, which, there's not much hope in that regard for now. Certain information is available on the damage of the environment as a result of war, but again, which has a lot of, thank you very much to Eoghan, because in terms of fact-based findings, it's mostly the CEOPS report. That is also a huge part of my article. And then there is no information about other natural resources or wildlife, both from Armenia and Azerbaijan. Again, I'm talking about fact-based findings. And the Ministry of Environment of the Republic of Armenia informed us that no examination of water and or other resources has been conducted after the war. So I've also been asked to apply to the Ministry of Defense of Armenia, which remarked that the record of the use of phosphorus type, because they also made announcements, and firearms by Azerbaijan in the direction of Shushi is based on the testimonies of witnesses and victims, as well as external signs and videos, but they refused to provide any details. So that's the only answer that they gave. And then there's also the case in the investigative committee of Armenia, but they refused to provide again any detail in this regard. This is just an image that has not even, it's not made in Armenia or Azerbaijan, but it's very symbolic to me in terms of what we are actually doing with the environment. As for Azerbaijan, it's not the first time, like the war at 2020, it's not the first time that Azerbaijan was accusing Armenia of firing white phosphorus. Similar complaints were voiced during the 2016 escalation, which is also known as Fourth-Day War, when Azerbaijan blamed Armenia again for firing white phosphorus near the Talish village, and Armenia denied such an assertion, and Azerbaijan did not provide any scientific proof for their accusation. And in 2020, Azerbaijan claimed again that Armenia had used weapons containing white phosphorus during the Second Karabakh War. There's a difference because according to Azerbaijani sources, Armenia both fired weapons containing white phosphorus and also had a plan to fire, but did not. Again, they said that they planned to fire weapons containing phosphorus in Fizuli, but they identified and decommissioned it. But on the other hand, the Hikmet Alizadeh, head of the State Ecological Security Service of the Ministry of Ecology and Natural Resources of Azerbaijan, declared that Armenia actually fired phosphorus bombs towards the forests in Shushi. And in this regards, again, they did not, and then also said that Armenia fired Topkhana forest. But again, they did not provide with white phosphorus, but they did not provide any scientific proof. The co-author of this article, Ismi Aghayev, applied to the Ministry of Ecology and Natural Resources of Azerbaijan to find out if a field investigation has been implemented to examine the usage of phosphorus weapons, as well as to assess the impact of war on the environment, or to develop a plan of further steps in this regard. And he did not receive a reply from the ministry so far. Yeah. And accordingly, the very last statement, all the statements and reports made by both Armenia and Azerbaijan about the impact of the Second Karabakh War on the environment have no grounds, scientific grounds, or those are not available to the public, including the media. And it's not clear whether both sides have a will and capacities and sources to carry out such an investigation and develop a plan for the recovery of the environment, or whether there is such an offer from local and or international organizations. I talked with Richard Pearshouse, who is the head of crisis and the environment at Amnesty International. And I tried to figure out why there is no mention about the environment in their reports regarding the 2020 Nagorno-Karabakh war. And the answer that I got was that because the environment has been weaponized so much, and both sides have been so aggressive in terms of accusing each other for terrorism or ecocide and stuff like that, that they did not trust any side, and then also they don't have resources, which is very important, to do a ground investigation that takes lots of resources, be that financial or be that the access to the ground. Which is why they did not. I'm trying to find if Human Rights Watch and UNEP has such plans. But what is clear for now is that it's not, I mean, neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan can blame international organizations in this regard, because they themselves don't seem to be interested in conducting an independent and objective ground investigation to assess the impact of the Second Karabakh War on the environment. So it's still about accusing each other, which is extremely sad. And then very last slide, coming back to the image that I made in 2020. So when I made this with my phone, actually, I was thinking back in August 2020, a month before the war, actually, which started in late September. I was seeing this image as a, I don't know, as an environmentalist or someone who cares about the environment and nature. And I saw this as a planet that we can reach where climate crisis is solved and people are more caring towards the environment and stuff like that. And then when I looked at it after the war, like I still see it as the nature and the environment being targeted by the governments of both, not only Armenia and Azerbaijan, but by also other countries, but we are talking about this case now, the environment being targeted by the governments, whereas it has to be cared, not targeted. And what I'm trying to say is that the meaning of this image has been totally changed to me after the war. That's it. Yeah, thank you very much to the University of Michigan and for having me. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mariam. And so we have time for question and answer. We in the back here are experiencing a few sort of technological hiccups, but I hope everything looks okay on our audience side. So I'm going to start with some questions from the audience. Martha is mentioning, goes for Owen, but I think both of you can speak to this. She says, since you mentioned civil society can help, what is the role of citizen science in the assessment of the environmental damage and need for remediation or in the monitoring of replanting, water, infrastructure building, species, census, etc.? So I think this is an excellent question. If you guys can speak to it from your perspectives.
Yes, shall I take that? Yeah, I think it's a brilliant question, and it raises a brilliant point. If this essential monitoring is not going to be done by the government or by anyone else, then yes, it is left to the citizens to do it and to arrange and citizen science. So that's something we've been looking at for a long while, to use in conflict settings as a means to not only get this essential data, but also as a way to help connect people to the landscape, to feel a sense of stewardship over it. And it can also be, if it's done in a cooperative way, it can also maybe be associated with some kind of peace building elements as well. And I think it really is a terrific idea. It's something that would be difficult but not impossible to do. I think there'd be people willing to fund the equipment, to fund the kind of logistical side of this, to get this data and to get the cooperation. And it's, yeah, I'd be really interested to hear if anybody would be willing to actually, take it forward in reality, because it's certainly something we would like to be involved with. And it's got so many win situation, as far as I can tell.
Not sure if I'm answering exactly to the question, but I do find it important that citizens are more demanding, and they demand from their governments to, in this case, to provide facts instead of just making announcements, to provide facts, at least regarding to their country. So if we're talking about Armenia, I expect citizens of Armenia to have a critical mindset and to demand facts. So when any official is making an announcement saying that a white phosphorus probably have been used or something like that, then I expect them to demand from the Ministry of Environment or other organizations to provide facts, and then later on to follow that up. So if since last November, a year has passed, and where are we at this point? And that's also the responsibility of the citizens, not just scientists and journalists. And also, I would very much like our citizens to not to be a part of the propaganda, especially on Twitter. And again, share facts, do fact checking. You don't have to be a journalist to do that. Those are there are different levels of fact checking, and don't be a part of this hashtag wars and stuff like that, but rather be more concentrated on the facts. So to sum it up, be more demanding from your governments. Do have a critical mindset and do the fact checking, and also take care of the nature and the environment on a daily basis. You don't have to have a disaster or a crisis to actually start caring about that.
That was I really like that answer, Mariam. That's a good one. Just to come back in on the citizen science, I've just been reminded of a kind of previous example, which could maybe work in Nagorno-Karabakh, and this was in the Colombian Amazon, and they have a big problem with pollution from gold mining there as well. And there was a citizen science project ran there by the University of Bath in the UK, with people out there obviously, and they helped design the project, the kind of indigenous people in Colombia, and it was really successful. And that just to kind of, if people want to look at that, check that out. There was a workshop we ran last year at the European Citizen Science Association conference, which was on citizen science in conflict zones, and the presentation on that is there. And I think that's maybe something that it's a methodology that could be lifted and used perhaps in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Thank you so much, you two. I wonder if you guys can speak a little bit about your collaboration between the two of you.
Yeah, should I start? So for a long while, because I started working on this since February, or was it February? Yeah, or maybe already January last year, in a framework of the project that I mentioned. And I forgot to say that it's going to be published in Caucasus Edition, which is a journal for conflict transformation. So I've been looking for facts as a journalist, and I could not find anything basically till one day suddenly I found the report by CERPS on Twitter, and then I found Eoghan on LinkedIn. Yeah, because and I asked him to have an interview, which you can check whenever the article is published. So that really made me happy, because I've been struggling for months to find again a fact-based, anything that is based on facts, not assumptions, not announcements, not propaganda, but actual facts. Yeah, and that's how it started.
It sounds like you followed the same line of inquiry that I did in many ways, in trying to understand the impact of the war on the environment, and found this report. Oh, and coming back a little bit to perhaps the methodology of CEOPS. One thing that I'm interested is in you folks are a small team and you're tackling big conflicts. What happens after these reports are being published? Do you go back, and is there a sort of emphasis, or is there a motivation to actually expand the reports or work with local organizations who may or may not have access post-conflict to adjust, to re-examine the sort of initial report that's out there?
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, I guess first of all, the Nagorno-Karabakh war is very unique in that it was so short. The other conflicts we're looking at are these really protracted, forever wars, you know, like Libya and Syria, Iraq, etc. So Nagorno-Karabakh is kind of different in that instance. It's a very distinct start and end produced report, and then it is definitely something we kind of want to take a look at again.
Just to interject, I mean, historians would think about this differently, right? I mean, as this conflict is really a conflict that's quite long, and has its roots, of course, in the sort of post-Soviet space. So I think, and it would actually be interesting to also retroactively look at the 1990s and think about what the environmental impact there was and how this has even perhaps furthered them.
Yeah, I mean,
huge constructions. Probably now.
Sorry. So yeah, I was just going to say it's a really interesting point on the 1990s. So there's this conflict going on, and I'm not sure of the numbers from the 90s, but I checked earlier the numbers for last year. Azerbaijan and Armenia are the 6th and 8th ranked in the countries that spend most on weapons as a fraction of GDP. So there's all that money and resource that could have been spent doing other things. One of which maybe building up better environmental institutions, better governance, monitoring networks, etc., etc. So absolutely, yeah, you're right to flag this kind of historical element. And I was just thinking more the kind of armed, high intensity conflict. But no, you're absolutely right. And yeah, just to return to what CEOs want to do, yeah, absolutely, we want to continue looking at these places long after the conflict is finished, because it is that post-conflict period which is really important to making sure lessons are learned and you know, to copy the kind of the cliches like build back better and make sure things are done in a sustainable way. Now that's what we would like to do. We would also like to do things like citizen science projects, but it kind of, all these ambitions kind of collide with the reality of the size of the organization. So what we need to do is we need to grow. We need to get more staff members. We need to get bigger. But of course that requires funding to do so and generous donors. And being as it is such a kind of niche topic, this kind of work often falls between the gaps. So yeah, in answer to this question, we would love to continue to release a report every year. What's happened this year? What's happened? You know, track it over time. But yeah, it's just it's a matter of capacity, unfortunately.
And in the collection of your data, if you can talk us a little bit through this. I mean, you mentioned it, of course, but maybe you can sort of take us into sort of your daily activities and sort of tracking these as the conflict unfolds. Do you spend time in a way with people on the ground, or I mean, obviously not in physical form, but do you spend time talking to people on the ground?
So yeah, so definitely that's what we try do. It's important to not to sit here in isolation just looking at satellite data. It's important to talk to people who are on the ground, who can tell you what's actually happening, can verify what you're seeing from the satellite imagery, and can guide you a bit and really help. And we kind of been doing that to some extent in places like Yemen. It's been that kind of approach has been more difficult in Nagorno-Karabakh for exactly the reasons kind of Mariam was describing. It's it's hard to find kind of independent people who we would be comfortable, would be comfortable that they were sharing reliable information and independent information. It's really difficult.
So Mariam, can you tell us a little bit more about your sort of general activism on the ground?
In terms of the article, right?
Or in general, sort of, where are you seeing your work go from here once you've published this piece, and what's your future going to look like?
So both as a journalist and documentary filmmaker, I'm pretty much interested in, as I mentioned earlier, environment and human and animal rights. And I had the idea of working on this since November when I saw those videos, and then the whole, I followed the articles published mainly in Armenia, because it should probably be mentioned that Azerbaijani articles are usually, the domain is not accessible for Armenians, so oftentimes, so I don't have an access to them. Sometimes, not often, but sometimes. But then there's Twitter. So I and then because I was already participating in a project with other Armenians, Georgians, and Azerbaijanis, and I had to choose a topic. I very much wanted that to be related with the environment, and we struggled for a while to find a other contributor. And then we struggle with the sources, of course. It took this long because we still struggle to get a proper answers from our governments, actually. Because I myself refuse to accept them not answering at all, and then you have to apply several times, or stuff like that, that journalists on a daily basis. And also probably I also should mention that oftentimes not even the bodies, but friends or people with whom I discussed the article had this thought that, oh yeah, why do you cover the environment if humans also suffer and stuff like that, which I absolutely understand, considering the situation that we have in Armenia now. But at the same time, I find it very important to cover exactly the environment and the nature. And I know that recently an article has been published at EVN Report in this regard, but I still, it's my personal point of view and opinion, but I still have not seen an article or any kind of journalistic piece that is completely objective in this regard, and where the environment has been prioritized, not your nationality or country. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to do with this article, to make people think about the importance of the actual environment that is not separated from, humans are part of the environment, and we very much need the environment to exist, basically. And then also, because there is so much talk about patriotism and nationalism, it depends, related to the war. And then at some point, the environment is being totally excluded from the discourse, as if that's, and the song mentioned by the System of a Down, is called Protect the Land, but at the same time, it has more to do with patriotism or nationalism, whichever you prefer. If you check out the lyrics, and rather than actually talking about the environment. So what I'm trying to say is that it's very much obvious in popular culture as well. And my intention is, again, to remind people to think about the impact of war on the environment, because when you have these military equipments, then you hit the forests. It's not just about humans, and it has to be again, researched, and finances from the government have to be given to the researchers and academics to do their job, which is something I don't see so far. I don't hope anyone from the government to read my article. I'm not that optimistic, but if they do, then I would very much like them to have different priorities from both sides than they do now.
Yeah, it sounds to me that you're really stressing the entanglement of the environment and human life as, of course, conflict and war, and its impact on environment and agricultural lands eventually, and of course on biodiversity, as we have seen, will eventually impact the way that people live on the ground, and the pollution of groundwaters, or of course also ammunition, unexploded ammunition, as it is being still there in the region, of course, affects the quality of life that people can live in these regions and the way that people can live off the land. So a super important thing. And of course, it's a very complicated issue if we think about, of course, conflict, or thinking about the environment and nature in the course of conflict, as the conflict is still, of course, not, it didn't end, so to speak, with the peace agreement or the ceasefire agreement, but rather the conflict, of course, lingers. And so emotions are high, nationalist sentiments, of course, understandably, for many people are what drives opinion making and what drives decision making, as people are, of course, eager to defend their homeland, and so nationalist, of course, sentiments and emotional sentiments are high, and so which makes, of course, this kind of research that Eoghan is doing very, very difficult in this kind of context. And of course, in that sense, we need to, of course, push for this kind of research to continue, and access to be gained to facts on the ground, which are so difficult to gain, as Eoghan has, of course, told us in the very beginning, and sort of just trying to find sources to create this objective international report that draws on different sources, and it's super difficult to actually disentangle that and step outside of these emotions that are reigning so high in the context of course, violent attacks on human life. And so when it's a very difficult and emotional, I think, subject that we are finding ourselves here in. I want to thank you both for your presentations, and hope that everyone will join us tomorrow as we are moving onto the ground and looking really at sort of what people are doing for the environment in the current context, and looking at local activism related to wildlife, related to forestry, as well as related to water resources that became, of course, a very hot issue also during the conflict. I appreciate both of you, and I hope to continue this conversation, and we're looking forward to reading your piece, Mariam, and of course, Eoghan, if any updates are coming from your side, we would be happy to share also with our audience. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.